Chapter 3. A week later, Ranat's tin was almost spent. He'd given Gessa 23 sides, twice what he owed her, but he'd felt some undefinable, misplaced guilt, and giving her less hadn't seemed right. He'd pretty much moved into the nameless bar where he'd met Gessa. What had followed was a blur of long nights, forgotten conversations, and painful mornings, until he'd found himself with enough tin to keep the shakes at bay, but not enough to continue down the spiral he'd started on. Ale and beer, he thought, too expensive. He should have switched to glog long before he did. Always the connoisseur. And now he was being followed. He hadn't been sure, not at first, but now there was no doubt. He'd started going to different bars just to check. The same two straight-backed men, looking uncomfortable in their peasant's clothes, their messy hair, and carefully layered grime unable to mask the air of confidence they exuded towards the poverty around them. An invisible wall of pride. They didn't look like the church, but they smelled like it. Ranat cursed at himself, and finished the last swill of glog. Who knows how long they'd been trailing him? It'd been a week since he'd been sober enough to notice anything. He glanced down at the silk pouch cradled in his lap. 5, maybe 6, 3 sides, a few discs, and a handful of copper balls. Enough to drink for the next few days, if he paced himself. But now he had to deal with those two before he could enjoy it. He pushed his way into the street and headed north. The lip was maybe a span away, and he could lose them there if they tried to follow him that far. He took a roundabout way, sticking to the most crowded avenues, box-like. 2-story tenements of limestone leered on either side. It was the tombs, he repeated to himself. It must be. He'd been getting greedy. A few years ago, he'd found a burial list of some of the founding families. Generations of top church officials. Old money. He'd hit a few, then try to convince himself to wait a while. But it had been too easy. Easy tin, easy booze. And every time he'd think, this time I'll stretch it out. This time the haul will last a month, maybe 2. But his hauls never lasted that long. Now he'd pissed off the wrong family. Someone had found their ancestors' treasures missing, and started looking into it. Ranat had always wanted to ask someone. If the highest levels of heaven were so great that people would pay tens of thousands of 3 sides and salvation taxes every year to get into one, why would they need to be buried with sacks of money? Was there one final tax once you got there? He glanced over his shoulder, back down the crowded street. If he didn't lose the pair following him, he thought he might get the chance to find out. Neither were in sight. It was nearing midday, and the clouds were sinking lower, the drizzle thinning to fog. He slowed his pace a little. Something slammed him from the side, so hard it knocked the wind out of him before he hit the ground. He had no idea where they'd come from. The man that had tackled him got to his feet. Another one stood behind, looking down at Ranat, who lay curled on the wet flagstones, gasping for air. The first one brushed himself off, muttering curses. "Next time you could be the one that jumps into the goddamn mud," he said to his companion. He was large under the rough wool peasant garb, with a sand-colored mustache that had hit his mouth. Ranat, through his painful gasps, suspected he was sneering. The second man, clean-shaven and black-haired, with a forgettable face, said, "Stop complaining. It's not like they're your clothes. If you don't like getting wet, you should have went into a different line of work. Tie him." He turned to address Ranat as his partner rolled him over and bound his hands. Ranat was faintly aware of 100 sets of eyes as people gathered around the unfolding spectacle, slowing their pace as they passed, pretending they weren't watching. "Ranat Trotz," the second man intoned, gaze bored as if reading the words off Ranat's face. "You have been tried, sentenced and convicted of murder, and struck from the books of heaven. Your execution will take place by the will of the grace of Fam. Until such time, or until dead, you are to be held in the pit for public viewing. Have you any statements?" Ranat craned his neck to look up at the faces of the 2 men staring down on him, and of the mob of onlookers who turned away. The smell of the muddy stone was cool and soothed his lungs, which still burned for air. One word bounced around his head, tightening the knot of panic that was building deep in his stomach. One word that fell out of his mouth before he knew he'd uttered it. "Murder?"